welcome everyone. Hopefully everybody can hear me well, and beautiful morning out. So I want to welcome everybody. My name is Bill Carger, co-president, Temple Beth Ann Brotherhood, along with Steve Schneider. Again, we want to welcome you this morning to one of our Zoom lectures, and thank you very much for joining us. Just want to keep a couple things I'll say before I really get into opening it up for the speakers and having Stu Slavid do a quick introduction. Brotherhood continues to think of ways to bring programs to you. So certainly I welcome any ideas that people have for these programs coming up now or into the near future. Please let either myself or Steve Schneider know. We also want to thank Bill Rapkin and Access Framingham for certainly helping us out this morning, and as always, helping us out in the future with these Zoom lectures. We'll do our best to keep everybody membership informed of what we're doing now and in the future. Just look on our website at www.tempbetham.org for more information about Brotherhood. For today's lecture, right now we have Dr. Robert Krim, who is an associate professor in the Department of Business, where he teaches entrepreneurship and innovation. Again, he also is joined by Alan Earls, who is an historian and a fantastic writer, that per Bob. So I will allow Stu Slavid to turn it over to do a formal introduction in a little bit. With that said, I'm going to turn it over to the rabbi to say the motzi. So thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much, Bill and Steve, and thanks to Dr. Krim for being with us this morning. I'm honored to start us off with a blessing for our food. The Talmud records a statement that reminds us how lucky we are to have such easy access to food. It says, "How much effort did Adam, the first man, exert before he found bread to eat? He plowed, sowed, reaped, sheaved, threshed, winnowed in the wind, separated the grain from the chaff, ground the grain into flour, sifted, kneaded, and baked, and only afterwards he ate. And I, on the other hand," says the Talmud, "wake up and find all of these prepared for me." So we give thanks for the gift of sustenance in our lives, and I invite you to join me in the Motzi prayer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Rabbi. Just keep in mind, everybody's on mute, so please add your questions in the chat. We'll do our best to get to everyone's questions. Certainly Dr. Krim and then Alan will also be fielding your questions as they present. But again, please add any question that you might have in the chat. So Stuart, I'm going to turn it over to you to formally introduce both Dr. Krim and Alan.
Thanks, Bill. Good morning, everyone. Dr. Robert Krim is the leading expert on the factors that have driven and continue to drive unparalleled innovation in Massachusetts. As founder and leader of the Boston History and Innovative Collaborative, he spearheaded the organization in a multi-year study covering all Boston's 4 centuries and involving hundreds of experts on the forces that drove these innovations. Earlier, he developed a bus tour, enlivened by a talented actor and exploring the sites of many of Boston's most intriguing innovations. Very popular, the tour operated for 8 years and inspired creation of a children's book, What's the Big Idea?, as well as a play at the Boston Children's Museum. Most recently, his revelations about Boston have prompted Logan Airport to hire Krim to develop a permanent innovation exhibit near the International Terminal and Terminal C at the airport. From Massachusetts to the world, 4 centuries of innovation. He's a professor of innovation at Framingham State University. Before passing, his uncle and aunt, Alfred and Edith Hanover, were members of our temple. Alan Earls is an independent writer and consultant covering business and technology. A former editor of the Mass High Tech newspaper, he's the author of several books on Massachusetts history, including The Birth of the Age of High Tech. Boston Made, From Revolution to Robotic Innovations That Changed the World is available on Amazon. It was published earlier this year. And now I give you Dr. Robert Krim and Alan Earls.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Bill and Stewart and the rabbi for the introductions and the motzi this morning. And so we're here this morning to talk about what we found out in working for 20 years on what makes Boston one of the world's top innovation centers. And in doing that, we'd like to not do this in any academic way, but in a way that I think might appeal to you, which is we want to tell some of the stories of innovation to you, and then spend some time looking at why these occurred in Boston and why Boston has been and is one of the most innovative places in the world. So we started this investigation back in the fall of '97 to gather information for a bus tour of Boston innovation sites. And we probably knew about 20 innovations that were better known in the city at the time. And we started to look for more. Eventually, we involved hundreds upon hundreds of people and hundreds of organizations in this decade-long effort. In fact, one of the people who I met along the way was Mayor Yvonne Spicer, then at the Museum of Science. So what do we mean by an innovation for this investigation that we've done? So we're talking about an innovation originated in Greater Boston and changed the nation or the world. So we're taking not all innovations that have been done in Boston, but we're looking at only those that met that criteria, that they really rose to the place of changing the nation or the world. In looking at innovation, a lot of times people automatically define it as changes, inventions in technology, and maybe in healthcare. We've used what's an expanded definition because we feel that really these are very similar in ways. And so innovations in finance, innovations in education, and social innovations, innovations that started here and spread to other parts of the nation or the world. So all 5 silos of innovation were investigated along the way. So by 2002, we had gone from that 20 or 25 to about 200 major innovations originating in the Boston area. And by 2004, we exceeded 400 innovations, and we know of hundreds of others that would meet this definition that have happened along the way. The important thing about these numbers is and we were very surprised by it, is that the total number of innovations is huge. No other city and region in the United States has this and has documented it. And we found along the way that no one really had studied Boston innovation and looked at this sheer number and breadth of innovations. As I say, it's unmatched by any other urban region in the US and perhaps in the world. And we were surprised. We were just trying to do a tour at the beginning. And lo and behold, we happened on something which was far more profound than we had any reason to guess was the case. And so the key question for us in this organization that Stu mentioned in the introduction, Boston History and Innovation Collaborative, was why was Boston so innovative over time? It's one thing to say, okay, we have these large numbers, but then the question really arose for us after 4 or 5 years of how are we going to figure out the why? people ask you, the press asks from other cities. And so here's what we took on. We got, along the way, many of you might read Scott Kersner in the Boston Globe Innovation columnist. And as he said, relative to the innovation, Boston consistently punches above its weight. And the question is, as we look at this, most other cities, we can just go back for a second. Most other cities that have studied their innovations start at World War II and look at the past 70 years. That's certainly true of Silicon Valley. And Boston is, of course, a lot older, and our innovations go back to the first 10 years of European settlement in the area. So we were faced with a question of sort of, in looking at the why, how would we do it? And we decided that we would take each of 50 out of those 400 innovations and look at what the drivers, what the reasons are that people informed us along the way as to what they thought had caused this innovation. We spoke with hundreds and hundreds of people and came up with 24 of these reasons, or drivers, as we like to call it. Some of them are, quite apparent. We had public education in Massachusetts before any other state in the United States, before many other countries. Maybe that was the reason. Other people feel that there was local funding earlier on for innovation. And of course, a lot of people feel that, well, it's the number of higher education institutions and or the number of research universities and teaching hospitals. In any case, we took, as I said, 50 innovations along the way out of the 400 and made sure that they were balanced chronologically and balanced in terms of the different silos and that sort of thing. And went very deep on studying why each of these 50 innovations occurred in Boston at the time. And in fact, the book that we have, Boston Made, summarizes for you the 50 different stories that we found. So we looked at the 24 drivers on each of those 50 cases, tallied that, ran the statistics on it, and we came up with 5 drivers that really made most of the difference. One on the top drivers was dynamic entrepreneurs, people willing to break down any wall holding them back in terms of the innovation. When I say entrepreneurs here, I'm not just talking about business entrepreneurs, but people in various worlds, whether education or social innovations who do that. Second was that they weren't acting alone. Each of them developed or were part of a vibrant network of people, or cluster, as others might use that term. Third, they tended to have local funding, and that made a difference in terms of that innovation getting off the ground. Fourth was local demand, that there were people who wanted to adopt it or buy it or take it on, perhaps at an earlier stage than would happen in many other cities. And fifth was that the entrepreneurs were ones that found it easier to operate and to bring that innovation to a national or global market. So these 5 drivers, 4 of them are local. And the phrase that we came up that incorporates the 5 was the bump and connect. the idea that it is the connection of all of these working together, the five working together, that made the difference, not each individually. All five drivers work together like ingredients in a great sauce. Some might say a secret sauce of what is it that makes Boston so innovative over time. So a couple of stories of the innovation, which might highlight a little bit of how we came up with the analysis. The first of the stories is one of perhaps one of the most famous innovations in the city, Alexander Graham Bell and the invention of the telephone. In the history of looking at that innovation, why was it in Boston that Bell invented the telephone? Bell is somebody who was an immigrant, brought up and educated in Edinburgh, worked there, then moved to London and worked there, then moved to Canada, in a city in Canada, Brantford, Ontario, and again was working on things. But he came to Boston in the early 1870s from Canada. And one thing was that it provided a job, which he needed, and he was an expert in terms of teaching the deaf, and that was his main field. So he taught at Boston University. This is an image of it back in near the Boston Common in the 1870s. But the other thing that brought him to Boston was the fact that Boston was, with New York City, were the two centers for the improvement of the telegraph. The telegraph, as you probably know, was invented in the 1840s, and actually by a man from Charlestown, Massachusetts, but who didn't do the innovation in Boston. In any case, Bell came in the evenings to this building, which was owned by Charles Williams, and was really at the center of the new developments in the telegraph industry, which were being worked on at the time. They were trying to see how many messages they could have on telegraph wires. It was called a harmonic telegraph. And Bell was particularly interested in this. And so he rented out the garret at the top of the building. There's the inside image of it is on the picture here. And he went to work, at least theoretically, trying to figure this out. Along the way, he became interested in a second question related to the telegraph, which is, could it be possible to have the human voice be carried over a telegraph wire? In other words, could you have a conversation on the telegraph? And Bell knew that he needed help in doing this. And one of the people who he had met who worked in this building on the ground floor was Thomas Watson, who worked for the Charles Williams of the building sign. And Watson was very good at building models, including working models with electricity at the time. And Watson worked up in the garret with Bell. Bell also needed somebody who could help him on filing a patent application and doing the draftsman's role, the diagramming it. Lewis Latimer, son of runaway African-American slaves from Charleston, South Carolina, had been brought up in Chelsea and was a draftsman at a firm over on School Street in Boston. And so he was brought onto the network, onto the team that Bell was putting together. Bell was faced with a question which all startups have, which is money. This actually is the diagram that Latimer had drawn. So Bell had been developing a network of people who he thought might be willing to put up some of the money so that he could keep employing other people and developing his instruments. Gardner Hubbard was the father of one of the deaf women who Bell had been teaching at BU. And Hubbard decided to put in funds into Bell's effort. It wasn't a company at the time, it's just an effort. And Hubbard also helped bring in one or two other people along the way. So the experiment to try to do the voice over the telephone had begun to grow. Bell, this is a drawing of Bell working in his lab. By this time, we're talking about March, April of 1876. And the beaker that he's holding has acid in it and was part of trying to work on how voice in a liquid could be turned into a voice over a wire. And this particular day, Bell, by mistake, spilled the beaker with the acid on his leg, and he shouted to Watson, who was in a separate room separated by a thick wall, although they had a telegraph wire going between the two rooms. And Watson heard what Bell had said on his implement in that side, rushed in to the room to help Bell along the way. And they realized that they had struck pay dirt, that their experimental telephone could work. And so over the next 8 weeks, they took longer and longer wires and did demonstrations, eventually doing one between Boston and Cambridge of a couple of miles. And the word had begun to spread in the newspapers and otherwise. The telegraph, of course, was the great communication system of that era. And so this led to Bell being invited to go to the International Exposition to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. And they had gathered manufacturers and inventors from around the country and invited a group of the leading scientists and business leaders in the hottest technologies to come to Philadelphia. And Bell was given one of the roles of actually demonstrating the telephone. And there are about 25 leaders of the scientific community who were standing about 30 or 40 feet away from the implements, including the Emperor of Brazil, who was there, and the head of American Telegraph, as well as the first head of the Smithsonian Institution. The experiment worked, which was not true, by the way, of all the other demonstrations he had done. But it worked and very impressed the leaders who were there. And of course, within the day, the news had spread to Boston. So when Bell got back to Boston 3 days later, Charles Williams said to Bell, "I really want to buy the telephone." And Bell said, "Well, if I can employ you at making it and then you can buy that. And so Williams got the first two telephones in the world. One was telephone with the number 1, and that was in his office over here, which is on Court Street in Boston. And the second one he put in his house in Somerville, connected by a telegraph wire. And shortly after, within a week or two, Gardner Hubbard and Bell and the other investors set up a new company, Bell Telephone, and began the manufacture along the way. The news spread, of course, internationally, and Queen Victoria invited Bell to come to Buckingham Palace to demonstrate it. He did that. Within 90 days, they had set up manufacturing in England for it. Obviously, it was the hottest technology at the time. So just to review this on our 5 drivers, you have here Bell, a dynamic entrepreneur, meeting the idea of breaking through any walls to make this thing happen. He helped to develop a network of people to work with him. He was able to get local funding on this. And there were people who were very excited about buying it, even without the thing ever having been manufactured before. And then the national and global market blossomed. The telephone spread to New York City within 6 months or 8 months or something like that. So the bump and connect idea you see in this example with the telephone. We didn't just find these 5 drivers in 1 or 2 of the 50 innovations, but in so many of them along the way. Alan, could you review one in the healthcare world?
Sure, Bob. Thanks, and hello to everyone. Yeah, the provocative title of the slide here sort of says it all. Dr. Sidney Farber, who wouldn't take no for an answer. In the late 1940s, Dr. Farber was on the staff of the Children's Hospital in Boston, and in the course of his work, he often came in contact with patients suffering from childhood leukemia, which at the time was more or less of a death sentence. 85% of those afflicted with the disease would die. The situation bothered him, as would anyone, but fortuitously, he had an insight, one that he immediately seized on. He knew that malignant cells in bone marrow, that's the origin point for the leukemia disease. And he'd also learned along the way that the nutrient folic acid is critical to bone marrow growth. So he made the intuitive leap that if folic acid could perhaps be suppressed, the absorption of it suppressed in some way or eliminated in patients with this malignancy in their bone marrow, perhaps leukemia itself could be stopped. Now, of course, he had no research lab of his own at the time, but he did have the attention of some of the staff, what you might call a network of pediatricians who were anxious to help their patients, and of course, parents of children with this disease. So he was able to come up with a chemical, aminopterin, in his team. And when this material was administered to children, the results were incredible. The first group of patients, 16 patients and 10 achieved a remission in a very short period of time. And this became effectively the birth of chemotherapy for children and adults, which is, of course, in the interim, saved innumerable lives globally. With those kinds of results, one might have expected that he would be treated as a hero and given all kinds of support. But at the time, the medical establishment in Boston was dubious and sometimes even a little bit hostile. He was, after all, a pathologist, not an oncologist, and not a medical researcher per se. And with that, underwhelming response, other people might have been discouraged, but he said no. He just kept going, and he found other sources of support. Fortuitously, members of a group called the Variety Club of New England, a group of people in the entertainment industry, were looking for a charity to support, and they got the word about what Dr. Farber was doing at Children's Hospital, visited his lab. He became very excited and decided to support him. This led directly to the funding of the Children's Cancer Research Fund, and about a year later, based on an interview with a young boy, not not described by his actual name, but just as Jimmy, who was suffering from leukemia. The Jimmy Fund was launched. This boy was on a national radio show and got all kinds of attention. And this in itself became sort of an innovation because sports teams, initially the Boston Braves and then the Boston Red Sox, worked to support this charity. So you had a whole slew of things happening thanks to Dr. Farber that ended up moving this forward. Farber died in the early 1970s, but not before further enhancing his reputation as a researcher and fundraiser and building the nucleus of a treatment team. This then became the Dana-Farber Research Institute in the 1980s, which has global fame, Dana being an industrialist who was interested in supporting this work. Farber was a truly dynamic entrepreneur, medical entrepreneur, not going to take no for an answer. He had that vibrant network to work with fellow pediatricians and obviously others in the medical field, even perhaps the people that weren't ready to actively support him. Local demand, of course, and as we mentioned, he helped find or create a local funding source. And inevitably, there was global market demand for this because this was a global problem, not just a Boston problem. So there's the bump and connect in action again. And I know Bob and I can't go into the detail of all of the innovations we touch on, but Bob can perhaps talk about a few of these represented by these illustrations on this slide.
Sure. One of the major healthcare innovations that came out of Boston was the first use of anesthesia, in this case ether, to be able to operate on somebody, which opened up surgery that could happen inside the body cavity as a result of anesthesia. That was Mass General, 1846. 3 years before, Elias Howe had in Central Square in Cambridge invented the sewing machine. King Gillette invented the first disposable razor down on Atlantic Avenue, 1903. Of course, Boston was had the first public school in what became the United States, Boston Latin School, which occurred 85 years earlier in Boston than in New York City. The next slide to the right, the next image to the right, are the twins who were involved in the first organ transplant ever in the world at the Brigham Hospital, 1954. Boston, of course, had the first subway in the Western Hemisphere, the third in the world, first state to have marriage equality in 2003 as a result of the state Supreme Court. The landing on the moon wouldn't have been possible without the capsule and the work that was done at Draper to do a minimizing of the size of the computer systems needed for the capsule. Out in Woburn was the work of Charles Goodyear, who vulcanized rubber, the first person to do that and change the world. And of course, the invention of the chocolate chip cookie by a Framingham State University graduate, Ruth Wakefield, in her restaurant in Whitman, Massachusetts. So, and most recently, of course, is the work that was done on messaging RNA and Moderna's work. Of course, the Johnson & Johnson work was mainly done at the Brigham, and then Pfizer has considerable things. So Boston has been at the center of the anti-COVID work. So our book, Boston Made, really tells these stories and shows the analysis along the way. It's a very readable book along the way. As I mentioned earlier, we talk about not just medical and technical innovations, but also social innovations. And one of the most important ones is one that I'd like to talk about just for a second, which is, as most of you are aware, that Boston, which was settled by Europeans in 1630, brought African slaves to to the town 8 years later in 1638. And so moving right along at the time of the American Revolution, Massachusetts, which was the first state that threw out the British, and there was a necessity for a constitution to be written that didn't have an appointed royal governor. And John Adams was pressed into the role of writing the first constitution, and included in the preamble, all men are born free and equal. The process of getting that constitution approved was unique in the world at the time, another innovation really, which is it was the first constitution which was approved by a vote of all the towns and villages in Massachusetts. In one of those towns out in Western Massachusetts, there was a public reading, as there were in the other towns, of the Constitution. And one of the people there was a enslaved African-American woman, Beth, and she decided on hearing the Constitution preamble that she would sue for her freedom with the help of a local lawyer. She won in court in that town in the Berkshires, and the jury said that she was being held illegally in slavery. Her owners appealed the case to the new state Supreme Court that had just been set up that year. And that Supreme Court ruled that, along with another case of a male slave in the Worcester area, Quock Walker, ruled that both were free based on the preamble really having the force of law. Here's the ruling by the first state Supreme Court. And in very bold writing here, slavery in Massachusetts was forever abolished at this meeting. Just another point of comparison, New York State freed their last slaves 47 years after Massachusetts. Again, this change. The other thing that we found along the way, and this is our last main point, and I'll go over it very quickly, is that over the 4 centuries of innovations in Greater Boston, really Massachusetts might be the better definition of it, that there have been 4 major economic collapses. And each time that collapse was turned into a growth period by a new wave or new waves of innovation. This happened in the 1640s, 10 years after the colony was started. It happened in 1776 when the British were forced out in March of 76. 85% of the population had either died or left Boston, and it had looked like the town would be a ghost town in the future. And it came back, inventing the China trade, inventing banking, the textile industry, others. Third time was when the collapse of the sailing ship, the wooden sailing ship industry, and we came back again, shoes and textiles and phones. Textiles and shoes declined from the 1920s to the 1960s, a 40-year really downturn. And the comeback was driven by electronics, mutual funds, IT, and of course, biotech. So overall conclusions that came out of what was originally a tour and was a great partnership with the Museum of Science actually at the time, is that Boston is the most innovative city or state over these 4 centuries in the United States, and one of the most in the world. Our innovations have been driven by those 5 drivers acting together. And third, that we've gone through times of economics collapse and come back through new waves of innovation. anyhow, this is our history. It's a history that's not that well known, but that's why I was asked to do the exhibit at the airport, and why we decided from that to write the book. And we want to take your questions now.
Dr. Krim, thank you very much. Alan, thank you very much. I'm just looking to see if there were questions that the group has. Yep, go ahead, Jack.
Thank you. Very good presentation. Did you address the fact that Boston was very innovative in religion as well with the founding of the Christian Science Church?
We did in the study, but did not in the book. But yes, the development of the Christian Science Church was important, and in terms of what has been picked up, the idea that there are forces in the world of medicine that has to do with spirit. Really, it's a seminal work in both medically as well as religiously.
I see that Dr. Spicer has put in a question in the chat room. Mayor Spicer, are women and people of color documented in the work? I know the answer. I can give a short answer, but I know you can give a longer answer.
Yeah.
Short answer is yes.
The short answer is yes. Of the 50 innovations, a third were ones that were women, immigrants, and people of color played a substantial role in the innovation. And in fact, it was an organization that got founded out of that research conclusion that and 20% of patents that are filed from people in Massachusetts are made by people who are new immigrants to the state.
And I also see that Howard Goldberg is unconvinced regarding the why Boston. It could have happened anywhere, he suggests in the chat room, or perhaps it could have happened anywhere. So maybe I'll let you tackle that one too. But again, it's that sort of secret sauce notion. And I think I know I'll just comment that I read a very interesting comparative study of Philadelphia and Boston and their differences in a great many things, including innovation over time. And the historian from Philadelphia who wrote that book 40 years ago concluded that a lot of it came from the sort of religious and cultural outlook, the differences in willingness to sort of go the next mile and go over the next hill, as opposed to just being happy with stasis. Bob, I'll let you take a deeper dive on that.
Well, the study actually, the formal part of the study started in about 5 years into this. I was continually worried. In fact, woke up in the middle of the night saying, there's all this innovation and somebody's going to ask me the why. And that's what led to the Mass Technology Collaborative that many of you know, that's just up the road from Framingham, giving us this major grant, as well as a number of other institutions in the region, to look at the why. And I hear your skepticism. I can tell you that the process that we engaged in was of sort of the highest standards. We brought together a group of the leading economists, historians, and sociologists and others to oversee our research along the way, including Ed Roberts from MIT and Barry Bluestone from Northeastern, and a number of historians, leading historians in the area, that oversaw and went through all the work that had been done by the research staff that I had developed along with our organization, and did ratings that looked at the numerical ratings that had been done for each case, the scholarly group that matched what the internal staff had done. So we had a double research going on along the way, and the most advanced regression analysis along the way, and it came up with those 5 drivers at the top in 7 out of the 9 eras that we had divided the 400 years into. So I would be glad to give you more at some other time, Mr. Colbert. The information on getting a copy of the book, I see Mayor Spicer's, is we're on Amazon, and so it's very easy to get a hold of, as well as it's at Barnes and Noble's in Framingham and other places. So we encourage you to to take advantage of that. So.
Dr. Krim, I do have a question. Is there a way, and I apologize, I know I'm the one who told everybody to write these in the chat, but is there a way to, and it's more of a broad question, but is there a way to prevent collapses? Or, it sounds like they're inevitable. They're going to happen again. It's going to continue to happen. But how would we prevent the next collapse from happening, if that's even, again, possible?
Well, since the process is to a certain extent one that one can't predict along the way, the best thing to do is to try to be seeding your city with what appear to be the areas of the greatest scientific growth. So, I mean, we've succeeded in spades with the biotech industry, looking at the fact that there were 3 biotech companies in Kendall Square as of 1993, and we now have more than 1,000 biotech companies, and I think the number of employees is up to 110,000 in 25 years over where we were in 1993 when we had Genzyme and Biogen as part of the starting companies. So it's encouraging. Bumping and connecting is something which in the age of COVID has been difficult, but the best study that I've seen done on how much it helps to be in touch with diverse people who have diverse backgrounds was done by this Martin Roof, who was a professor at Stanford and is now in North Carolina, which showed that the people who were doing startups of companies, this was based on entrepreneurs who had been MBA students at Stanford University and had started up companies, that there were 2 groups that were identified. One, people who talked with a lot of other people who were not from the same background scientifically, could also be ethnically and otherwise, but the group that had a lot more contact with people outside of your individual field or your individual company did 300% better on developing patents and succeeding as a business than the others, 3 times better. So this is something which I read about after we had done the study, when I went to Framingham and actually had a chance to get out of the world of running a not-for-profit and actually going back and studying it. And I've talked with Ruth about this, and it shows the same sort of thing. A big study was done at Raytheon in Andover on where the best innovation within Raytheon came from. And again, it was the diversity. what's called the weak ties that people have. So how can you consciously, as a region or as a state, do that? That's a great question, and we've tried to help a little bit on that, but there's not an easy answer.
I would just throw in a couple of quick observations. One is that many of the the newer waves are based on older waves. You know, something as simple as having a well-trained industrial workforce, or you know, certain kinds of technologies that are broadly applicable. Pratt and Whitney is an interesting example. They were a loom making company in the Connecticut River Valley, and they became makers of aircraft engines because some of the you know, high standards of materials and machining and so on apply equally well to both. And I think that I have another. Oh yeah, then just my other thought would be that there's all kinds of clustering and subclustering in a place like Boston. I spoke to someone a couple of days ago in the industrial automation and controls business, and he was telling me that half a dozen of the most important companies in that field are in or near Foxborough, which at one point in the analog and mechanical era of control systems was the world leader. But these companies have all sort of gathered there either through spin-offs or just some process of agglomeration. And that kind of stuff happens all over Greater Boston for some reason. We seem to have good social connections.
So, by the way, some of the other innovations that you might find interesting is in terms of financing and why that is one of the drivers. Both the development of what was called the trust in the 1820s in Boston is one. And then second, venture capital was developed by George Dorio with his company after World War II, specifically to work on how to encourage a lot more companies to start up along the way. So, you know, the help that comes from a innovative financial sector combined with all the other factors that we have really makes a tremendous difference along the way. Other comments or questions?
Someone's asking, are you yourself an inventor? I'm not sure if that's directed at you or me, Bob. I'm not. I'm a wannabe.
I'm only an inventor relative to starting new not-for-profits, which I've done a couple of times in life, and so it's more social innovation. However, my dad was an electrical engineer and went to MIT and went to work for Raytheon. Was involved in invention along the way in many ways, and was very close to Percy Spencer, was the man who invented the microwave oven, one of the major ones along the way. So, inventor in a social realm, but not in the world of technology or medicine. True confessions.
Are there any other questions from the group? Coming up on the hour. So I just, Dr. Grimm, Alan, thank you very, very much. This was fantastic. Really appreciate your time this morning. Appreciate,
Thank you for the opportunity.
I just want to let everybody know, hopefully everybody enjoyed the presentation as well. Again, keep your eye out for communications on the next lectures that we put together. And just wanted to say thank you for joining us today, to all the membership, and to Dr. Spicer, thank you for joining us today as well. Rabbi, thank you for coming in, saying the Motzi. Bill, thank you for allowing, helping out with the Access Framingham. And Stu, appreciate your hard work in getting Dr. Grimm and Alan to join us and certainly share their information this morning. So again, I appreciate everybody's time, and look forward to seeing everyone again very soon.